This range is for qualified military personnel, not walk-ins. I suggest you find somewhere else to be." The old man looked at the sergeant for a moment. Just a moment. Then he nodded, picked up his rifle case, and walked outside to sit on a bench in the sun. He did not argue. He did not produce identification. He did not say a single word in his own defense. That silence, that patient, unhurried silence, was the first thing the sergeant should have noticed. He did not notice it. And that is where our story begins. There are men who carry their credentials in a breast pocket, laminated and ready, who need the world to know their rank before they will consent to be taken seriously. And then there are men of another kind entirely. Men whose record lives in the wood of a rifle stock, cut by hand, one mark at a time, across decades and distances that most people only read about in doctrine manuals. Men who do not need the world to know anything at all, because they have long since passed the point where the world's opinion mattered to them. The sergeant would meet one of those men today. He did not know it yet. He would know it before lunch. The high desert has a quality of light that is unlike any other place on earth. In the early morning, before the sun has fully cleared the ridgeline, the sky above the training range holds a particular shade of pale blue, almost white at the horizon, deepening overhead to the color of old steel. The air is thin and cold and carries a faint alkaline taste, the taste of dust and distance and elevation. Sound travels strangely up here. A voice raised at the firing line will carry 200 yards before the wind takes it. A rifle shot, by contrast, arrives before the sound does, or so it sometimes seems, the impact of the bullet at the target appearing in the spotting scope like a small, sudden punctuation mark at the end of a sentence the shooter has already finished speaking. This is the kind of country that does not forgive imprecision. It is country that demands calculation, patience, and a specific, almost meditative quality of attention. The instructors who run the long-range marksmanship school at this high desert installation have a phrase for it. They call it reading the country. They mean the wind, the mirage, the angle of the light, the way the terrain channels and bends the air. They mean 1,000 things at once. They mean the thing that cannot be taught from a manual, only from 10,000 rounds expended at distance, only from years of lying behind a rifle, in conditions that punish every error without appeal. The class of candidates assembled at the range that morning did not yet know how to read the country. That was why they were here. That was the entire point. 12 men and 2 women, all of them experienced shooters, by the standards of their service branches. All of them accustomed to hitting targets at ranges that would have seemed extraordinary to a civilian, were now confronting a distance that made everything they already knew feel insufficient. 1,000 meters, a hair over 1,000 yards. In still air, at sea level, it was a challenging shot. At this elevation, in the high desert morning wind that came down off the ridge in shifting, unpredictable gusts that the wind flags at the firing line registered imperfectly, it was something else entirely. The range safety officer, a lean, quiet man named Chief Warrant Officer Elias Pruitt, had been watching the wind since before sunrise. He had been watching it the way a sailor watches a changing sky, not with alarm, but with the careful, ongoing attention of a man who understands that conditions are the primary variable and that conditions do not stay still. Sergeant First Class Daniel Harker had not been watching the wind. He had been watching the gate. Harker was 29 years old. He had been at this posting for 14 months. He had, in that time, developed a proprietary sense of this installation, a sense that the range, the equipment, the candidates, the schedule, and the reputation of the school were his personal responsibility in a way that outpaced his actual authority. He was not the school commandant. He was not the range safety officer. He was the duty NCO for the range office, responsible for sign-ins, for paperwork, for ensuring that only authorized personnel accessed the firing line. It was a reasonable job for a man of his rank and experience. He had made it, in the 14 months since his arrival, into something closer to a kingdom. He had the gift, common to certain kinds of authority, of making his presence felt in a room. He was broad-shouldered, physically imposing, with a voice that carried, and a manner that suggested he had never once in his life been uncertain of his own correctness. The candidates who rotated through the school learned quickly that Harker was the man to avoid irritating, not because he had real power over their evaluations, but because he had a talent for making the days feel longer and the paperwork feel heavier for anyone who crossed him. He had seen the old man coming from 100 yards away. He had seen the faded canvas hat, the civilian boots, the absence of rank on the collar or the sleeve, and he had made his determination before the man had reached the door. Walk-in, civilian, range tourist. Someone who had perhaps read about the school in a magazine or seen it mentioned online and had decided to present himself at the gate with a rifle case and a vague sense of entitlement. It happened more than people would expect. Veterans, some of them, men who had served decades ago and who felt that their prior service entitled them to access that it technically did not. Harker had dealt with the type before. He was good at dealing with the type. Direct, unambiguous, polite enough to avoid a complaint, but clear enough to leave no room for negotiation. The old man had come through the door of the range office carrying a rifle case that was, if you paid attention, a very interesting object. It was long, made of a hard composite material, the kind that was neither cheap nor new. The latches were worn to a dull brass. The surface showed the kind of patina that comes not from neglect, but from decades of use. The way a well-maintained tool looks after it has been used continuously for a very long time. There were no visible markings on the outside, no manufacturer's logo, no unit patch adhesive, nothing. The old man himself was in his late 60s, perhaps early 70s. He was not tall. He was not, by any obvious measure, physically intimidating. He was lean in the way that men get lean when they have spent a lifetime burning more calories than they consumed. Not the manufactured leanness of a gym, but the functional leanness of a man whose body had long ago stripped away everything that was not needed for the work at hand. He wore a plain canvas shirt, the color of old khaki, with 2 breast pockets. His boots were civilian, brown leather, well broken in. His hat was a faded olive canvas, the brim shaped by years of habit. He wore no watch. His eyes, Harker would remember later, though he would not remember them in the moment, were a very light gray. The color of the sky above the ridgeline in the early morning, the color of old steel. "Morning," the old man said. His voice was quiet and unhurried, looking to sign in for some time on the long line. Harker looked at him. He looked at the case. He looked back at him. "This range is for qualified military personnel," Harker said. "Not walk-ins. I suggest you find somewhere else to be." The old man regarded him for a moment with those pale gray eyes. There was no anger in them. There was no offense. There was something else, something that Harker, in his certainty, did not stop to read. Something that had the quality of patience, so deep and so long established that it had passed beyond patience and become simply the man's natural relationship with time. "Understood," the old man said. He picked up his rifle case. He walked out the door. He found the wooden bench on the shaded side of the range office building, the one that faced the firing line at an angle, and he sat down and put the case across his knees and folded his hands on top of it, and waited with the unhurried stillness of a man who has learned to wait as a professional skill. Chief Warrant Officer Elias Pruitt had been watching from the corner of the room, near the window that faced the firing line. He had seen the whole exchange. He had noted the rifle case. He had noted the way the old man carried it, not the way a civilian carries an unfamiliar object, but the way a man carries something that has been in his hands so many times the grip is unconscious. He had noted the boots and the hat and the absence of rank, and then he had noted the hands, and the hands had told him something the rank insignia had not. Pruitt said nothing. He went back to watching the wind. The morning qualification session began at 800 hours. The 12 candidates and 2 instructors took their positions at the firing stations. The targets at 1,000 meters were small, dark rectangles against the pale face of the berm, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The spotting scopes resolved them into precise dimensions. The wind at the firing line was reading left to right at 6, gusting to 8. The wind at the mid-range, judging by the flags and by the mirage shimmer in the scopes, was doing something considerably more complicated. The first candidate to engage was Specialist Rains, 24 years old, winner of the Battalion Marksmanship Trophy 2 years running, the acknowledged top shooter in the class. He settled behind his rifle with the unhurried competence of a man who was comfortable here, who had been comfortable at the firing line since his first qualification course, and had only grown more comfortable with each passing year. He made his adjustments. He breathed. He broke the shot. The spotter called it, "Miss, 7 o'clock, approximately 2 feet. Rains nodded. Adjusted. Engaged again. Miss, 8 o'clock, 1.5 feet. The range was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a session proceeding normally, but the tighter quiet of a group of people watching something not go the way they expected. Rains engaged 3 more times, 3 more misses. Clean misses, not near misses, not grazes, but rounds that arrived at the berm in the wrong place, with a consistency that suggested the problem was not with the shooter, but with an input the shooter was not reading correctly. The lead instructor, a warrant officer named Calloway, who had been shooting competitively for 15 years, stepped to the line and watched the next 2 engagement cycles from the candidates who followed Rains. Both missed. Calloway watched the wind flags. He watched the mirage in his scope. He looked at the ridge to the north. He looked at the flags at the 500-meter position. Something was happening in the corridor above the range, some interaction between the terrain and the morning heating of the air, that was bending the wind in ways that the instruments at the firing line were not capturing. "Hold the line," Calloway said. He turned to Chief Warrant Officer Pruitt. "Elias, you got an at your read on what's happening at 800 meters? Because the 500 flag isn't showing it, and the line flags aren't showing it, and I've got 5 consecutive no scores from the top shooter in the class." Pruitt looked out at the range. He looked at the ridgeline. He looked at the pale sky. "That's a terrain channel situation," he said. "Wind's coming down the draw, and it's being pushed left by the ridge face before it crosses the target line. It's not showing at line because it's happening above the surface. You'd need to know what this corridor does specifically, not the general wind, this specific corridor." Calloway nodded slowly. "Anyone here shot this specific corridor before?" he asked. He turned to the assembled candidates. Then, after a moment, he looked at Pruitt. "Anyone on the range?" And that is when Chief Warrant Officer Elias Pruitt turned and looked through the window at the wooden bench where the old man sat with the case across his knees, his hands folded, his hat brim angled against the morning light. "There might be," Pruitt said. He walked to the window and pushed it open. "Sir," he called, "would you have a moment?" The old man looked up. He gave a small nod. Pruitt went to the door and held it open. The old man stood, lifted the case, and came inside with the same unhurried economy of motion he had shown before. Sergeant Harker was at his desk. He looked up. "This is a closed session," he said. His voice had the automatic authority of a man who does not realize the ground has shifted under him. I already told this individual he is not authorized to be on the range. He's authorized when I say he's authorized, Pruitt said. His voice was not loud. It was simply final. I'm the range safety officer. Sir, if you wouldn't mind stepping to the line. The old man nodded. He carried his case out through the range door and to the firing position that Pruitt indicated. Harker followed to the threshold. He looked at the other candidates, some of whom were watching with expressions that were carefully neutral in the way of people who can read the room and have decided not to commit to a position yet. I want it noted, Harker said, loudly enough to be heard by the nearest candidates, that this individual was not processed through the sign-in procedure and has not presented the appropriate qualification documentation. The old man, who was now settling the case down at the firing position and unlatching it, did not appear to have heard this. The nearest candidate, Specialist Rains, looked at Harker, then looked at the old man, then looked back down at his own position. Harker laughed. It was a short, audible sound, designed to carry. I'd like to see this, he said, to no one in particular, to everyone within earshot. A few of the candidates exchanged glances. Not laughs, just glances. What came out of that case was not what anyone on that range had expected to see. They had expected, perhaps, a modern precision rifle, perhaps a bolt action in one of the configurations common to long-range competition shooting, perhaps a chassis rifle or a hunting platform in a magnum caliber. What came out of the case was old, not neglected, not worn out. Old in the way that a thing gets old when it has been used continuously and cared for continuously and has become, over decades of use, something beyond what it started as. It was a bolt-action rifle of a type that several of the more historically aware candidates recognized as having been out of standard service for a generation. The stock was walnut, and it showed the deep patina of real age, the color of it somewhere between amber and brown, the grain of the wood visible through the finish in a way that synthetic stocks simply do not reproduce. The metal was blued, but the blue had thinned at the high points, showing the steel beneath in small bright crescents at the edges of the receiver, at the action handle, along the barrel channel. There was no optic rail visible from the side. Calloway was watching. He had seen a lot of rifles. He tilted his head slightly, looking at the profile of the scope mount, and then he understood. What was mounted on that rifle was not a modern scope, with its battery-dependent illuminated reticle and its battery-dependent rangefinder. It was a period scope, the kind that had been manufactured in limited numbers for use by a specific community in a specific era, and it was mounted in rings that had been fitted to that specific rifle by someone who knew what they were doing. The scope was small and clean, and there was nothing flashy about it, and it was the right tool for a very specific kind of work. The old man ran the bolt. He checked the chamber. He settled into position behind the rifle with a movement that was so fluid and so absent of any performance that several of the candidates found themselves suddenly very still. There is a way that people who have done a thing for 20 years lie behind a rifle. There is another way that people who have done a thing for 40 years lie behind a rifle. They look similar from a distance. Up close, the difference is visible in the absence of any wasted motion, in the way the body finds the correct position not by adjusting but by arriving, the way a key turns in a lock it was made for. The old man arrived. He did not adjust his position. He did not shift his elbows. He did not rock the rifle on the bipod. He simply settled and became still, and the stillness was total, the kind of stillness that is not absence of motion, but presence of intention. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these quiet men deserve to have their stories told, there is a Patreon link in the description below where you can help keep this channel going. The candidates watched. Harker, from the threshold, watched. Chief Warrant Officer Pruitt watched through his spotting scope, which he had already oriented to the target. The old man made 2 small adjustments to his scope. He watched the wind flags at the line. He watched for a longer moment the terrain at the ridge. He watched the heat shimmer above the 500-meter mark. He was reading something. He was reading the corridor that Pruitt had described, the wind coming down the draw, pushed by the ridge face, arriving at the target line from an angle that the line flags did not show. He was reading it not with instruments, but with 40 years of memory of this specific range, this specific corridor, this specific interaction between the terrain and the morning air at this elevation. He breathed in. He breathed out. He let half a breath go. He broke the shot. The rifle's report was clean and final in the desert air. Pruitt's eye was at the spotting scope. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Center group." The old man ran the bolt, extracted the case, loaded the next round. His hands did not hurry. The movement was identical to the first, not repeated, arrived at the same way the body arrives at the correct position, naturally and without performance. Second shot. "Center group," Pruitt said. Nearly identical impact. The range was very quiet. Third shot. "Center." Inside the first 2. Fourth. "Center." The old man paused before the 5th round. He watched the ridge. The wind had shifted. Some minor variation in the draw channel, something that would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching that specific piece of terrain with the specific knowledge that comes from having studied it for a very long time. He made a half-click adjustment. 1 half-click. Then he broke the 5th shot. "Center," Pruitt said. "Clean 5-round group." He pulled his eye from the scope and looked at Calloway. Calloway was looking at the old man. The old man was pressing a small brass brush through the bore of the rifle, with the same unhurried attention he had brought to everything else. Raines, who had fired 5 consecutive no-scores from the top of the class, was looking at the old man with an expression that had passed through several stages in the last 2 minutes and had arrived at something that was close to reverence. The other candidates were not speaking. The range had the particular quality of quiet that falls over a group of people who have just watched something that has reorganized their understanding of what is possible. Harker broke it. "I want to know," he said, and his voice had the tightness of a man who has committed to a position and is not yet willing to abandon it, regardless of what the evidence is saying. "Who authorized this individual on the line? There is a procedure. There is a sign-in requirement. There is a qualification verification requirement." He took a step forward. "Who is this man, and where is his authorization?" The voice that answered him did not come from the firing line. It came from behind him. "That is a very good question, Sergeant." Harker turned. The school commandant had a way of arriving without being heard. It was not a skill he had cultivated deliberately. It was simply the byproduct of a career spent in environments where noise was a liability and quiet was a survival trait. Colonel James Hargreave had been the commandant of the long-range marksmanship school for 3 years. Before that, he had been a great many other things in a great many other places, most of which appeared nowhere in the literature that was generally available to people who had not held the relevant clearances. He was 61 years old, gray-haired, compact, with a face that had been arranged by decades of weather and fieldwork into an expression of permanent calibrated assessment. He was carrying a coffee thermos, and he had clearly been at the range for some time before announcing himself. He had arrived, Pruitt would later estimate, at roughly the moment the old man had settled into position. and he had watched all 5 rounds from a position behind the line where he could see both the target sector and the firing position and the faces of everyone on the range. "That is a very good question," he said again, "and the answer to it is going to take a moment to fully appreciate." He looked at Harker steadily. "Sergeant, I'd like you to do something for me. The rifle. You see the stock." Harker looked at the rifle, which the old man had laid back in its case with the action open. "The underside of the cheekpiece," Hargreaves said. "There's something cut into the wood there. I'd like you to look at it and read it to me, please." Harker walked to the firing position. He looked down at the rifle in its case. He bent slightly to see the underside of the cheekpiece, where the wood was smooth and worn from years of contact with a shooter's face. Then he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when he is reading something that is reorganizing the architecture of his understanding. The wood beneath the cheekpiece was marked in a way that was not decorative and not accidental. Cut into the surface of the walnut stalk with something fine and controlled, over what was clearly a very long period of time, were small, precise marks. Not scratches, deliberate, controlled, identical marks, arranged in groups, the way a man counts something he needs to remember. There was also, cut deeper and larger, a service number, not a modern service number format, an older format, the format of a generation of service that had ended before half the people on this range had been born. 200, Harker began. His voice had changed. It was still controlled, but it had lost its certainty, the way a building loses its foundation, gradually and then completely. 211. 211 confirmed, Hargreaves said. He turned to address the candidates, not performing for them, but including them in something he judged they needed to understand. "At what distances, do you think?" Harker's mouth moved. He looked at the marks again. He looked at the service number. He looked at the old man, who had turned slightly on his shooting mat and was watching the exchange with the same patient, uninvested calm he had brought to the entire morning. "Long range," Harker said. He was reading something, reading the service number against some index in his memory. Then something in his face changed, and it was not a pleasant change. It was the change that comes over a face when understanding arrives too late to do any good. This is a unit designation. I know this unit designation." "Yes," Hargreaves said, "you would." He turned to the candidates. "The unit designation on that stock," he said, "appears in your doctrine manuals, not as a historical footnote, as a primary source. When the methods you are here to learn were being formalized, when the range tables were being verified at altitude for the first time, when the environmental correction protocols that are now standard were being developed and tested and proven, they were being developed by people from that unit, specifically by one person from that unit who carried out more confirmed long-range engagements in high-altitude terrain than any other operator of his generation." He paused. He did it with that rifle. The range was very quiet. Warrant Officer Calloway was looking at the old man with an expression that had moved well past professionalism into something that was simply human awe. "The instructor who taught me to read a corridor like this one," Calloway said. He said it quietly, not for the crowd. He said it the way a man says something when he is working it out for himself. He used to talk about someone. He called him the Standard. He said there was one man who had established what was actually possible at altitude, and everything that came after was measured against what that man had done. He looked at the old man. I thought it was a figure of speech. The old man tilted his head slightly, a small smile, unhurried, and without any performance in it. "Your instructor," the old man said, "was a warrant officer second class when I last saw him. He had just hit a sustained wind target at 1,400 meters in a monsoon condition and refused to believe the spotter because he thought the calculation was wrong. I made him run it again. He hit it again. Calloway stared at him. "I trained under a man who trained under you?" he said. "I imagine so," the old man said. "If he taught you to watch the ridge before you watched the flags." Calloway was quiet for a long moment. "He taught me that on my first day," he said. "Then yes," the old man said. "I imagine so." Colonel Hargreave turned to Sergeant Harker. Harker was standing very still. The loudness had left him completely. What remained was a man in the process of understanding what he had done and being unable to find anywhere comfortable to stand in the understanding of it. He had, this morning, told a man with 211 confirmed long-range engagements that the range was not for walk-ins. He had laughed, audibly, in front of his commandant and a full candidate class when that man had been invited to demonstrate. He had then attempted, while the demonstration was in progress, to challenge the man's authorization. He had done all of this in front of Colonel Hargreave. And he had done it to the man who had trained the instructor, who had trained the warrant officer, who was now lead instructor of this school. "Sir," Hargreave said, looking at Harker with the steady, level gaze of a man who has already made his decisions and is simply confirming them, "I'd like you to ensure the sign-in documentation for our guest is prepared correctly. Full name, service number, prior qualifications as stated. All of them." He paused. "All 211. He did not say anything else to Harker. He did not need to. The conversation that would happen in his office at the end of the day was already written, and Harker could read it plainly in the commandant's eyes. Hargreave walked to the firing line. He stopped in front of the old man, who had stood when the colonel approached. "It is an honor," Hargreave said. He did not salute. The old man was not in uniform, but the way he said it was the equal of any salute, perhaps better, because it was not ceremonial, it was simply true. "Elias called," the old man said. "He said you had a class working a corridor problem. I thought I might come up and look at it." "You drove 3 hours to look at a corridor problem," Hargreave said. "It is a very interesting corridor," the old man said. Hargreave smiled. It was a brief smile, the kind that crosses the face of a man who has been in the company of remarkable people long enough to recognize and appreciate the specific kind of understatement that they favor. "Would you be willing," Hargreave said, "to speak to the class?" The old man looked at the candidates. They were watching him with the attention of people who have understood, in the last 10 minutes, that they are in the presence of something that does not come along often. "I'm not much for lectures," the old man said. "Neither am I," Hargreave said. "I was thinking more of a demonstration, and then some questions, the kind that don't show up in the manuals." The old man looked at the ridge. He looked at the flags. He looked at the pale, high desert sky. "All right," he said, and he settled back behind the rifle. What followed was not a demonstration in any formal sense. There was no lecture. There was no presentation. There was simply an old man behind a rifle and a group of candidates watching him and asking questions, and the old man answering the questions the way people answer questions when they know the answers not from study, but from the thing itself, from the 10,000 hours and the 40 years and the 211 marks cut into the wood of a rifle stock. He talked about the corridor. He talked about the way the terrain here funneled the morning heating of the air along the draw, and how that interacted with the prevailing wind direction at altitude to produce the left-angle push that the line instruments did not show. He talked about reading the mirage not just for wind speed, but for the column structure, the way the shimmer resolved differently depending on whether the wind was steady or variable, and what each structure meant for how you held and when you broke the shot. He talked about the relationship between elevation and bullet behavior, and how the corrections in the manuals were based on standard conditions that almost never existed in the field, and how you learned to build your own corrections from observation rather than from tables. He talked about patience. He talked about the difference between shooting fast and shooting right, and how there were situations where those two things were the same and situations where they were not, and how you learned to tell the difference. The candidates had their notebooks out, not because they had been told to, but because what the old man was saying was the kind of thing you did not trust yourself to remember without writing it down. Warrant Officer Calloway stood to one side and listened with the expression of a man who is hearing things confirmed that he had suspected but had never been able to fully articulate. Pruitt, who had arranged the old man's presence on this range, who had called him 3 weeks ago and suggested that the morning qualification session would be worth his time, watched from his position near the window and allowed himself something that, on his still face, appeared only as a slight relaxation around the eyes. At 1100 hours, the class broke for water, and the old man walked back to the bench outside. Harker was at his desk when the candidates filed back through the range office. He was doing paperwork. He was doing it with the particular focused attention of a man who does not want to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The candidates passed his desk without speaking to him, which was unusual. Normally there was conversation, small talk, the easy familiarity that developed over weeks of shared training. Today there was nothing, not hostility, something more instructive. The candidates simply did not look at him the way you do not look at a cautionary example when you are trying not to absorb what it represents. Harker felt it. He was not unperceptive. He was simply, as many people who substitute confidence for judgment eventually discover, wrong in ways that correct perception had not managed to prevent. He finished his paperwork. In the afternoon, the commandant asked the old man to walk the corridor with the candidates. Not to shoot, but to walk, to stand at the 700-meter mark and watch the flags from that position and explain what they showed from ground level that they did not show from the firing line. The candidates walked with him in a loose group and asked questions, and the old man answered them with the same quiet, unhurried precision he brought to everything. At the 500-meter marker, one of the candidates, a young woman named Chen, who had missed 3 of her morning shots and had been visibly frustrated by the misses, asked him how long it had taken before he felt like he understood what the wind was doing. The old man looked at the ridge. He looked at the flags. He thought about the question with genuine attention. At 500 meters, he said, I thought I understood it in about 8 months. I was wrong about that. At 1,000 meters, I thought I understood it in about 2 years. I was also wrong about that. He looked at her. At 1,200 meters, in the mountains, I stopped thinking I understood it and started working with what I could read. That was better. He paused. The wind is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be read. You never finish learning to read it. You just get less wrong over time. Chen wrote that in her notebook. She had been shooting for 6 years. She was, by any reasonable standard, an excellent shot. She would think about what the old man said at the 500-meter marker for the rest of her career. She would repeat it to candidates of her own in the years that followed, and they would write it in their notebooks, and they would repeat it further, and the old man's exact words, in this exact form, would travel forward through the institution in the way that true things travel, without attribution, becoming simply the thing that is known. By the time the afternoon session ended, and the candidates were policing their positions and preparing to break down for the day, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the range. The quality of the attention the candidates brought to their work was different, not more anxious, more precise. There is a specific effect that comes from watching a master at work in your own field, a recalibration of what possible looks like that makes everything you thought you knew about the task feel slightly larger and slightly more worth the effort of learning correctly. Sergeant Harker received his orders that evening. Not a reduction, not a formal reprimand, though the formal reprimand would follow through the appropriate channels. His orders were a reassignment. Administrative duties at a post 250 miles from this installation, with a supervisor who had been briefed on the specific circumstances of the reassignment and who would be watching. Harker drove away from the installation the following morning. He did not speak to the candidates before he left. He did not speak to Pruitt. He did not speak to Calloway. He stopped at the gate, and the gate guard processed his exit paperwork and said nothing, and Harker drove out into the high desert with the particular silence of a man who is replaying a morning over and over and finding nothing in the replay that changes the outcome. He thought about the rifle. He thought about the 211 marks. He thought about the service number and the unit designation that appeared in doctrine manuals as a primary source. He thought about the way the old man had looked at him outside the range office before going to sit on the bench in the sun. Not with anger, not with contempt, with patience. With a patience so deep and so long established that it was simply the man's relationship with time, the patience of a man who has long since stopped needing the world to understand him and has organized his life entirely around the work itself. Harker thought about that patience for a long time on the drive. It would be, his friends would later note, the thing that changed him the most. Not the humiliation, not the reassignment, the patience. The specific quality of a man who, having been told he was not authorized to be on a range where he had 211 confirmed engagements, had simply said, "Understood," and sat down on a bench in the sun and waited for things to resolve themselves correctly. Harker would spend several years thinking about that patience. He would eventually become a better NCO because of it. He would become, specifically, the kind of NCO who does not mistake his position for his authority, who does not mistake his own certainty for the truth, who does not look at an old man in civilian boots and a faded canvas hat and see a walk-in. He would become the kind of NCO who looked at who was carrying the rifle. Among the candidates, the stories spread the way certain stories spread. Not loudly, not with exaggeration, but quietly, from one person to the next, in the way that true things move through communities that know how to recognize them. Specialist Rains would tell it to his unit when he returned, and the telling would be accurate, because he had been there and because the experience had impressed itself on him with the specific clarity of moments that reorganize what you thought you understood about your profession. He would tell it not as an embarrassment to Harker, but as an instruction. He would tell it the way the old man's words about the wind had been instruction, as a thing that was simply and usefully true. The part of the story that Rains always told last, the part that he said stayed with him the longest, was not the 5-round center group at 1,000 meters in a crosswind that the instruments hadn't resolved. It was not the service number, or the unit designation, or the 211 marks. It was the bench. The old man had been told he was not authorized. He had said, "Understood." He had gone and sat on the bench. He had not argued. He had not produced documentation. He had not named himself, or his record, or his credentials. He had sat in the sun and waited for the truth to become apparent on its own terms. The most dangerous people in any room, Rains would say, when he told the story, are usually the quietest ones. Not because they are hiding something, because they have nothing to prove. He would pause. The sergeant was loud because he was uncertain. The old man was quiet because he was not. The long-range marksmanship school continued its work through the seasons that followed. New classes came through. New candidates lay behind their rifles and learned to read the wind and the mirage and the specific corridor that ran along the draw beneath the ridge. The doctrine manuals that cited the old man's unit as a primary source remained in the curriculum, as they had always been. The range at 1,000 meters remained the qualification standard, as it had always been. In the range office, on the wall behind the duty desk, there was a new photograph. It had been placed there by Chief Warrant Officer Pruitt, quietly, without announcement, the week after the qualification session. It showed a rifle, laid in an open case, the walnut stock catching the morning light. The photograph was angled to show the underside of the cheekpiece, where 211 marks were cut into the wood with the precision of a man who had done the work and then recorded it, one mark at a time, across 40 years. Below the photograph, Pruitt had written in his careful, steady hand a line that the candidates who passed through the range office read on their way to the firing line. The line was not attributed. It did not need to be. It read, "Credentials are what you show to people who cannot see what you are. Work is what you show to everyone else." The old man did not return to the installation after that day. He had come because Pruitt had called and told him the class was having trouble with the corridor, and he had helped them with the corridor, and then he had driven 3 hours back to wherever he went when he was not being somewhere that needed him. Calloway would call him once, in the months that followed, to ask a specific question about a shooting condition at altitude that had produced results he could not fully explain. The old man listened and asked 3 questions and then explained what the data was showing and why, and Calloway wrote it down and thanked him, and the old man said, "You'd have worked it out," and hung up. He was right. Calloway would have worked it out, but it would have taken him 6 months, and it took him 20 minutes with the old man on the phone. That was the thing about true expertise. It did not make you feel small, the way false authority did. It made the work feel larger. It made you want to get back to the firing line. Rains went on to qualify at the long-range school with the highest score of his class, which he would always attribute to one specific adjustment in how he read the corridor. Chen became an instructor. She used the old man's words about the wind, the ones she had written in her notebook at the 500-meter marker, in every class she taught, and she taught them without attribution because the old man had not named himself when he said them, and she felt that the words were truer without a name attached. The rifle, in its composite case with the worn brass latches and the 211 marks beneath the cheekpiece, went back to wherever it had come from. Whether it sat in a safe or hung on a wall, or lay at the bottom of another composite case, waiting for another morning, on another range, in another piece of high terrain, no one at the school could say. They only knew what it had done that morning, in the pale, high desert light, with the wind coming down the draw and the ridge pushing it left in ways the instruments did not show. 5 rounds, center group, in a condition that the top shooter in the class had not been able to read. And before that, a man on a bench, patient, unhurried, his hands folded over a case, his hat brim angled against the sun, waiting for the truth to become apparent on its own terms, as it always did, as it always will, for the people with the patience and the record to wait for it. The most dangerous person is the one who never needs to tell you who they are. The most powerful credential is the one that is still speaking long after the moment has passed. And the work, always the work, remains the only truth that matters. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, where the record speaks and the noise falls silent, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales, and if you would like to help me keep telling them, you will find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.